Tonight on Primetime Politics, growing costs and growing delays.
National Defence needs to have a better focus on costs.
Canada's Auditor General says there are major risks with the plan for new fighter jets. Karen Hogan joins us to explain why. And we have F-35 analysis from a former RCAF commander, retired Lieutenant General Yvan Blondin. Also, Canada's Chief Justice says the rule of law and judicial independence are under threat in many countries. We talk about that and the state of Canada's justice system with Richard Wagner. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, I'm Andrew Thompson with you tonight. Michael Serapio is on assignment. The Auditor General has some stark warnings about Canada's plan to buy F-35 fighter jets. Karen Hogan says it's likely to cost nearly 50% more than what was announced 3 years ago, and that number does not include paying for key upgrades and weapons. There are also potential delays to the F-35s actually getting airborne. Today's report flagging again a lack of qualified pilots, and it says facilities to house F-35 squadrons are years behind schedule. The Auditor General also finding that the government has moved too slow at converting office space into affordable housing, that First Nations people are waiting too long to get decisions about their status under the Indian Act, and that federal officials often ignored procurement and security rules in their dealings with GC strategies. And with me now is the Auditor General of Canada, Karen Hogan. Ms. Hogan, great to have you here in studio. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I do want to begin with the F-35 report. 3 years ago, this was being billed as a $19 billion project. Now you're saying the true number as of last year is closer to $28 billion, and there are other costs of up to $5.5 billion to be added on top of this. So can you break down where exactly this disparity is coming from, that we have such a big difference now between what was given to Canadians at the end of 2022 and now?
I think there's two elements that contributed to the increase in cost of this project, some which were well within control of national defense and some that were not. So the first number, that $19 billion, was based on outdated information. There was more up-to-date information available for the cost of planes that were not factored in to the original estimate. Then add on things like inflation, foreign exchange fluctuations, and just the global demand for weapons and equipment have just increased the costs. So those are the big drivers between the $19 billion and the $27.7 billion. The way National Defense splits up its projects, there were other projects that were needed, some infrastructure and missiles that were essential to have the F-35s be used as intended, and that's where the additional $5.5 billion that we identified should be added if you want to look at the total cost of transitioning from CF-18s to CF-35s.
Okay, so how should Canadians look at the cost of this? Because we've talked about the cost of the F-35 for years, and you're talking about potential extra costs coming up through the years. What does your work looking back say about what the costs could be going forward?
Well, back in 2018, my office did an audit on the CF-18s, which are the fighter jets that Canada already has, and we found that there was a shortage of qualified pilots. And we see that that risk still exists when we look at CF-35. So regardless what plane Canada ends up buying and flying, you're going to need a pool of qualified pilots. And so there's certain risks that I would like to have seen better managed based on our previous work that we've issued more recommendations on today so that they better manage costs and better manage some of those risks.
Yeah, you talk about the pilot shortage. You also talk about construction being behind schedule for fighter squadron facilities, one at Cold Lake, one at Bagotville in Quebec. Walk me through what's happening here with those delays and what it means for the F-35.
So National Defense tried to get ahead of things here. They knew that they needed to update their infrastructure at Cold Lake and Bagotville as well as across the country. And so they started to plan for that well before a decision was made on what aircraft to purchase. So then when the decision was made to get CF-35s, they had more specific information about what was needed in that infrastructure. And that's where the plans are not very responsive. They're sort of reactive to risks. And now there's about a 3-year delay on having those facilities ready. So what does that mean? It means that interim facilities are needed, which are going to drive the costs up even more. The cost of that, D&D hasn't determined yet, but that will see the costs of transitioning even increase further than what's in our report.
Okay, so we know the government is reviewing the F-35 project. We expect that to be done this summer. Beyond what you've already talked about, what needs to change and what does the government need to be doing to get back on track to have this full operational capacity for the F-35 that's been promised by the year 2033?
So we issued a few important recommendations. One would be to finish their plans. There are a lot of plans about different parts of this project. It's a long, large project, a long lead time. So they need to finish those plans. But they do need to do much more regular monitoring of their costs and update those at least annually, so that you don't see big fluctuations like we're seeing now. And then really a much more proactive risk management process versus the reactive one. A risk surfaces and then a plan's put in place instead of sort of seeing ahead and putting mitigation measures. So I think those three will help keep the costs and hopefully the time perspective online.
Okay, I want to shift to another one of your reports, which is looking at registration under the Indian Act. You say the government is poorly managing the process. So what does that mean in real terms for First Nations people who are trying to access services?
So under existing Canadian law, for First Nations peoples need to register under the Indian Act, and that gives them access to essential services like financial support for post-secondary education or certain medical treatments and transportation if they need to leave their community for health reasons. So these are real essential things. And what we found is that the department was taking on average 16 months to approve or to make a decision about registration under the Act. That's almost 3 times as much as their service standard of 6 months. And that's a really long time to be waiting to gain access to something that you have rights to under Canadian law.
So what's the reason for that? What is the government telling you about why we have these delays, and what are they doing to fix it?
So there were recent amendments to the Act that saw an increase in the applications for registration. So there is a resource constraint. But I do think the government needs to look at their processes to find some opportunities to be much more efficient. I think the public service should say we know we can process something as important as a passport much faster than we can process an application for registration under the Indian Act, and find some ways to be much more efficient with this. There is even then an interaction with First Nations communities, a partnership with some trusted sources and administrators there, but the funding for them hasn't been updated either since 1994 or is unstable and unpredictable, and that's not a good way to help transition some of these services to First Nations people. You need to give them the training, the resources, and the time to deal with this.
Right. All right, another report, GC Strategies. This is a company that you've dealt with before in terms of your reports. Last year there was a scathing report on the ArriveCAN app, which is linked to this company. But in today's report, it seems you're identifying a wider problem when it comes to contracts with this company. Why were the rules not being followed more strictly across the wider breadth of the federal government?
So this is our second report on professional services contracts. The first one came out a little bit after the ArriveCAN audit, and it was linked to contracts with McKinsey and Company. And now we're looking at contracts with GC Strategies. This was in response to a motion in the House of Commons. So it's taking us back to the exact same time frame. If you may recall, when I issued that report for McKinsey, I said I had no reason to believe that this would be unique to this one vendor. And here we are confirming that that's not the case. I think that the federal public service needs to sit back and say, why is there so many rules that are just not being followed? These rules are meant to ensure transparency, accountability, and good value for money. And is there too many rules? Are people circumventing them to go too fast? So I think the government has to figure that out and then make a decision about whether they need to reduce rules or just retrain folks on the rules that are there and apply them.
Okay, but as you say, it's not the first time we're talking about contracting rules in the federal public service with these companies. You've talked about some possible solutions. What do you think the sticking point here is that we haven't seen more action towards making sure that, yes, these rules are being followed, that everything is on the up and up?
So as I said, the time frame here is a time frame we've already looked at. So I wasn't surprised that this is just confirming the findings that we had beforehand. There were new changes made following of the work on ArriveCAN. And I haven't been able to see whether or not that is actually going to improve the process. What I am concerned about is it's adding another step or another rule. And I really encourage the government to take that step back and figure out, do we have too many rules, and what can we do to make contracting with the Federal Public Service more efficient, and then make sure that the rules are applied.
All right, Auditor General Karen Hogan, we have to leave it there, but thanks for your time as always.
Thank you.
And those reports from Auditor General Karen Hogan were figuring large in the House of Commons this afternoon. Conservatives pressing the government in question period on the F-35 and on GC strategies.
Today, the Auditor General released a scathing audit on the top ArriveCAN fraudster GC Strategies. This two-person basement dwelling company feasted on $64 million taxpayer dollars. This was a direct gift from the Liberal government, who allowed basic procurement rules to be completely ignored over the last 10 years. Canadians still don't know who did the work, what was done, if they were qualified, if they had security clearances. This is complete government incompetence. The ask is simple. When will taxpayers get their money back?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. I thank the Auditor General for her service. I note that GC strategy has been prohibited from government contracts for 7 years, and it's that standard, the minimum. As a member of Canada's new government and a new member of Parliament, we will uphold higher standards, Mr. Speaker.
According to Canada's Chief Justice, the rule of law and the independence of judges are under attack around the world. Richard Wagner says he's not referring to any specific country, but it was in response to a question about the Trump administration defying court orders in the United States. Here's the Chief Justice at his annual news conference.
There is no doubt that the rule of law and the judicial independence is under attack in many countries in the world. You know, when you see governments attacking the media, attacking the judges, attacking the lawyers, and universities, of course, that means that there's a good chance that you're in front of a dictatorship, autocratic government. But there are many places in the world living through those events right now. And I think we have to be careful. So the message for the people is be careful, but be optimistic as well. Because in Canada, we have a strong legal system.
And Chief Justice Richard Wagner is with me in studio. Chief Justice, welcome back to CPAC.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
You know, I want to begin with your comments today about the rule of law facing threats around the world. It was a question about the United States, and you know, you say you weren't singling out any one country, but do you believe, given what we're seeing in the United States, that America is potentially shifting towards autocratic rule or dictatorship because of the threats we're seeing to the judicial system?
Well, I'll let people decide on that issue. I didn't want to aim at one specific country because the problem is not limited to one country. We can see for the last couple of years that attack on the judicial independence and the rule of law, those attacks are present in many countries in the world. And that's why, probably because that's why the reason why people are so anxious now, I think, in Canada, maybe because of the most recent events, I agree, but it's been like that for a few years now. And you know, it's the Supreme Court of Canada is celebrating its 150th anniversary this year. And my colleagues and I have decided to visit 5 regions of Canada for that occasion. And we met people in Victoria, we met people in Moncton, and general public, students, high school students, law students, and they were all asking the same question. Do you think that what we see outside of Canada could come to Canada? And I said to them, you know, you have reasons to be anxious. I mean, we've never seen that before, but I think you should be optimistic as well, because we have strong institutions in Canada compared to the other countries. We have traditions, we have a strong bench, We have good judges, well-trained, probably the most well-trained judges in the world, governed by ethical principles. And all the stakeholders in Canada will recognize and respect the separation of powers and the rule of law. So that's why I'm saying, yes, be concerned, be careful, but at the same time, keep faith. Keep faith in your institutions.
Okay, now a lot of justices, as you know, refrain from commenting at all to media. You do an annual news conference, you do these interviews. As the Chief Justice of Canada, do you feel you have a responsibility to speak out when you see this happening around the world, when you see these challenges to the rule of law, not just here in Canada, but as you say, in a lot of countries around the world, in democracies where we're seeing the justice system backsliding?
Yeah, I think we have a responsibility to make sure to keep the trust and confidence of the people. Because if you don't have the confidence and the trust of the people, that will jeopardize our democracy. And one way to do that is to inform the people. And there are so much disinformation these days that the way that our court has decided to act is to provide as much information as possible, the right information to the citizens, so that they would appreciate their institutions. It's very difficult to appreciate and to like something that you don't know really. So we have nothing to hide in Canada. We have very strong institutions in terms of governance, in terms of legal system, in terms of universities, law faculties, and I want people to know about it so that they will keep their faith in those institutions.
Okay, lots to talk about from that news conference you gave today. I want to talk about judicial vacancies because 2 years ago you wrote to the Prime Minister over vacancies on the bench. You said it was a serious problem with serious consequences for our justice system, not just cases being thrown out of court because of delays, but also the strain of the caseload on judges. Today you're saying there's been a 75% reduction in federally appointed vacancies. So is that having the intended effect on the administration of justice and reducing some of these problems you've talked about?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There was a big, major increase in appointments. I'm very happy. Obviously, my letter worked properly. I hope I won't need to send another letter in the future, but it made a difference. It made a difference because there were some major problems because appointments were not made within a reasonable delay.
What do you see, though, as the future over the next few years for the state of our justice system, the capacity of our justice system? We've seen talk about overcrowded jails, about these continuing delays. Is the getting caught up on these judicial appointments, is that going to be enough? What else needs to be happening?
Well, access to justice will remain a challenge when we're talking about cost and delays. But I'm optimistic as well. I think that people realize, and governments have realized since we released the decision in Jordan, realized that they had to invest in the justice system. And I think that the governments, provincial governments as well, have invested. I think it's getting better. Appointments are made, but we have to look closely at the situation. It's an ongoing effort.
Right. Okay, we have a moment left. I want to change tack to something I found interesting in your news conference. You talked about artificial intelligence. That's what a lot of people are talking about today. Last fall, the Canadian Judicial Council issued some guidelines on AI for judges. Talk to us about the promise and the peril of that technology for the courts and how you see this technology being used going forward.
Now, you use the right words. There will be, and there is already, great advantage in AI. AI can produce very positive results. Management of files, for instance, in courts. But it creates also potential damages. And one of the topic in our guideline is to advise the judges that AI should never replace a judge in a judicial or legal analysis to come to a judgment. That's very clear. It will never replace a judge. The second issue is false information. We know recently in Ontario and in BC a couple of months ago, lawyers filed artificial jurisprudence that did not exist. So that's a danger of AI. So I think that people have a responsibility to make sure that everything that they file into the court record be real And I think that lawyers have a responsibility. The law societies must be concerned as well. And that will avoid those problems.
All right, Chief Justice Richard Wagner, thanks for being here. Really appreciate you taking the time for us tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Let's return to today's Auditor General's report on the F-35. The Defense Minister says the government is accepting the recommendations and that he's waiting for his department's own review. Here's David McGuinty on Parliament Hill.
This is a multinational partnership. There are many countries that are participating in the F-35 development, engineering, industrial benefits, construction. We are all in this F-35 project right now. It is a fifth-generation fighter jet at a time when the world is looking for fifth-generation fighter jet capacity right across NATO. I've just come from the meetings, and people are deeply concerned about what's happening, for example, in Russia and Ukraine. And so right now, we're taking the time we need to evaluate not just the Auditor General's important report. We accept her recommendations. We're going to be moving to implement them. Some we've already begun. But we're also waiting to see what the department says in its review that it's taken on, which will be deposited, I believe, this summer.
Well, let's continue the conversation on Canada's F-35 program in the wake of today's Auditor General report. Retired Lieutenant General Yvan Blondin spent 3 years as commander of the Royal Canadian Air Force. He joins me now. Good to see you once again here on PrimeTime Politics. Now, back in March, you joined us and said that given all the tension that was happening with the United States and with the Trump administration, that we needed to reconsider building Canada's future fighter force based solely on the F-35, that we needed to mitigate the risk of the F-35. How does today's report from the Auditor General mesh with that argument that you've been making?
Well, in my mind, it doesn't change anything. The Auditor General report is a report that comes usually a few years after a program has been set up, has been costed, and is going through. It's reviewing the estimates that were made and comparing it to what is turning out to be the real cost. Now, in this case, what I read from the Auditor General's report, the cost increase is really not about the cost of the airplane. It's about the cost of the program, what the government is doing to build the capability. It's about infrastructure that is costing more, infrastructure that is being delayed and therefore brings more costs, temporary infrastructure that has to be built because it is delayed, that is increasing costs. Everything is about infrastructure and stuff that was not necessarily included up front in the acquisition of the F-35. Whether specific weapons that were required were included up front or decided afterwards that since we're buying the airplane, might as well buy this missile or buy this system as well. You can add the cost afterwards and in a report, an accounting report, say the program is costing you more. But it doesn't change the fact that upfront, the airplane is what it's supposed to cost, and setting up the program has some issues. But usually those issues can be tied to government's handling of the program. I'll give you an example. In Bagotville, where they're going to build infrastructure to receive the F-35, there were added costs for environmental purposes. They had to build new hangars, and they had to decontaminate a soil that had been contaminated for years. That adds costs. They, for some reason, I'm not sure why, but they are displacing the alert facilities closer to the runway, and the runway itself. That's a 7,000-foot runway. It's 1.5 miles of concrete that has to be displaced 100 feet, not 100 feet longer, 100 feet laterally. The whole runway needs to be moved 100 feet. That costs a lot of money too. And I'm sure that was not necessarily planned up front. It's something that happened while they were preparing the hangars, preparing the operations, and figuring out that for some reason, the runway was too close to operations and needed to move. Now, you can tie all this to F-35 operations, but as soon as you're building some new stuff into old bases, there will be extra costs.
Okay, so we have the government reviewing the F-35. We've heard the defense minister on this. We expect that to be complete by the summer. And David McGuinty says he doesn't want to prejudge the conclusions. So what do you want to see in that review? Or perhaps do you think we even need to do this F-35 review at this point?
Oh, the review absolutely needs to be done. I think just because of the discussion that's been brewing around this issue, the review needs to be done. All factors need to be looked at, and a way forward needs to be pushed. Because at this point, I see two ways forwards. One way forward is we remain tied to the American way of doing business, American weapon systems, and we're going to be in this, if we do, for the next 40, 50 years, which means that everything tied to the F-35 or the fighter force needs to remain within an American system, American software, American network of communications, American secure systems. And we need this for NORAD, but not necessarily into everything. But if we continue remaining with the F-35 and not try to diversify, it means that we need AWACS airplanes, we need communication systems, we will need drones to go with our fighters in the future, and 20, 25 years from now, we will need 6th generation airplanes to replace those F-35. And because we are tied into legacy communication and security American systems, we will be tied into selecting American weapons for the next 50 years, which means being subject to the same dependence, reliance on a single provider, which is proven with the US not to be trustworthy. So it needs to be reviewed in what we can do, because this is our main partner for continental defense. It's not like we can pick up Canada and move somewhere else. Canada will stay close to the US, and because of geography, it will always be more advantageous to do defense together. And it is certainly to the US's advantage to do this with Canada. So NORAD needs to be done with the US. F-35 is probably the right platform to be doing continental defense and NORAD with the US, but diversification is required, a second fleet, and like we're doing with the economy, we keep doing business with the US, but we're looking for new partners to diversify and reduce our reliance on one sole partner. In defense, it's the same thing.
Retired Lieutenant General Yvan Blondin, I want to thank you for your insight on this. We'll certainly keep watching this story as it unfolds.
Okay.
And that's all for this edition of Primetime Politics. I'm Andrew Thompson in Ottawa. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.